You see me now?
Mm-hmm.
Have we got everyone online?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, sorry about the delay. There have been some rewiring issues, but welcome everyone to another Crossbeam seminar. We have two speakers here in person and one who will present online. And Kirsty Dunn, you are due to go first. Would you mind going first, still sticking with that order and sharing your slides online?
Yeah, absolutely, that's fine.
Great. Okay, great. I'll let you introduce yourself and your topic. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone see my screens okay? Yep, great. Well, hello everyone, my name is Kirsty Dunn and I'm going to be talking to you today about a project that I was involved with, which was looking at the role of bullying in the relationship between intellectual disability and mental health problems for adolescents. And this is a project that involved colleagues from the universities of Glasgow, UCL, Warwick and Oxford. And to give you some background to the topic, we know from previous research that children and adolescents with intellectual disability experience a rate of behavioural and emotional problems that's 3 to 4 times greater than their peers in the general population. We also know that this group are more likely to experience bullying than their peers. A systematic review that was conducted in 2016, looking at high quality studies which investigated bullying in the intellectual disability adolescent population, reported a weighted mean prevalence of 36.3%. And within this systematic review, studies which included a general population comparison group reported 15 to 40% for the general population prevalence. And for these papers that included the general population comparison group, all but one of them reported higher prevalence rates for their ID comparison group. As bullying is more prevalent among adolescents with intellectual disability, and this is known to be associated negatively with behavioural and emotional problems, bullying may contribute to the difference in behavioural and emotional problems between the general and intellectual disability populations. There was a recent study conducted in Australia using a nationally representative data set, which found that there was a mediating relationship where bullying mediated the association between disability and mental health in adolescents. And this study used a sample of adolescents with a range of different types of disabilities. Some people in the sample had an intellectual disability, but the data wasn't reported separately for different types of disability. However, our group was really interested in replicating this analysis for adolescents with intellectual disability, given that they're at higher risk of both behavioural and emotional problems, bullying, and they also experience cognitive and communication limitations. So in order to replicate this analysis, we might be able to assist with the development of more targeted interventions to assist this group. So we hypothesised that both parent and adolescent reported bullying at age 11 would mediate the relationship between early childhood intellectual disability and parent-reported behavioural and emotional problems at age 14. And to do this, we extracted data from the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a large UK-wide study, which includes data from all 4 UK countries. There are multiple waves to the data. The most recent one was collected this year, and it's based on children who were born between 2000 and 2002. In order to identify the adolescents within the population who had an intellectual disability, we used a grouping variable that had been created by one of our colleagues in 2020. And this involved using data from the Millennium Cohort Study. They had recruited trained interviewers to give cognitive assessments to the children at age 3, 5, and 7. And they then looked at the average scores within each age group. And if a child had a score that was 2 standard deviations or greater below that mean, they were classified as having an intellectual disability. And this information was also supplemented with parent and teacher reports of special educational needs. For the bullying variable, we had 2 separate variables. the parents were asked, to what extent is it true that your child is picked on or bullied on by other children? And they answered on a 3-point scale from not true to certainly true. And then the children were also asked, how often do other children hurt you or pick on you on purpose? And they responded on a 6-point scale from never to most days. We used structural equation modelling to conduct the mediation and analysis. We did this for parent-reported bullying and adolescent-reported bullying separately. So here you can see our mediation model. We've got the exposure, intellectual disabilities. This was collected from waves 2 to 4 of the Millennium Cohort Study, using the method I just described when the children were 3, 5, and 7. Our mediator, the bullying variable, was collected at wave 5 when the children were 11. And then our outcome variable was emotional and behavioural problems, collected at wave 6 when the children were 14, and this was reported by the parents. We also included a number of co-founders in our data. This was based on the literature on variables that have previously been associated with bullying and with behavioural and emotional problems. So we included gender, socioeconomic position, number of parents in the household, and parent mental health. We included participants in the intellectual disability group who were identified as having ID based on the method I just described. And to be included, participants had to have data on all of the outcomes, mediators, and covariates. And this gave us a sample size of just over 6,500 for the parent report and a little bit more for the adolescent report. But we still do have quite small numbers for the children with intellectual disabilities. For the parent report, there were 135 in the sample with intellectual disabilities, and for the adolescent report, 118. And you can see the table here. These are our results. We've got the parent model at the top and then the adolescent model. And given that it was the strengths and difficulties questionnaire we used to measure emotional and behavioural problems, we've got the total difficulties score at the top of this table, and that's the overall score of emotional and behavioural problems. And then there are 4 subscales within this measure: emotional symptoms, conduct problems, hyperactivity, and peer problems. And we've got the results for the mediation for each of these. On the far right, the highlighted figures are the statistically significant results. So we found that for the parent-reported model, parent-reported bullying explained 22% of the difference in total difficulties between the ID and general population group. And then if we look at the subscales to look at the types of difficulties and problems, we have 36% for the peer problems. So 36% of the difference between the groups in terms of peer problem score was due to parent-reported bullying. And then the next highest number we've got here is for conduct problems within this model. For the adolescent model, only 2 of the subscales were significant: hyperactivity and peer problems. The others were close to significance, but these were the only 2 that were actually statistically significant. So to conclude, our longitudinal analyses are the first to show that this mediating role of bullying in the association between the general disability and adolescent behavioural and emotional problems also applies specifically to those with intellectual disability. Parent report bullying explained the highest proportion of the inequality in conduct and the peer problems scales for adolescents with intellectual disability. It may be that communication difficulties experienced by individuals with intellectual disabilities might make it more difficult for them to express their distress or frustration at being bullied, and that this could in turn lead to emotions being expressed through challenging behaviour. Or alternatively, it could be that people who are experiencing bullying are already more sensitive to threat and more likely to become involved in interpersonal conflict. And we do know from the literature that those with conduct disorders or social problems are also more likely to be the target of bullying, which suggests there could be a cyclical relationship here, which is worth investigating. There are a number of limitations with the data that we used. For example, the self-report measure for bullying for the intellectual disability group. Generally, we would advise to use measures which have been adapted to make them easier to understand for adolescents with intellectual disabilities when investigating this type of question. But unfortunately, this wasn't done in the Millennium Cohort study, so the measure that we had was the same for every individual that completed it. We also used both parent and adolescent reported bullying measures to compare the differences there. Although within the general population and intellectual disability population, there isn't very high agreement between parent and adolescent reports on these types of measures. The parents also completed the outcome measure, the emotional and behavioural problems measure, as well as the bullying measure for the parent reported model. So there may have been some dependent measurement error there. In terms of future directions, as the bullying measure that we used was just one item, it would be really interesting to explore items that looked at a wider range of bullying, different types of bullying, whether it's verbal or pushing, excluding children from games in the playground, to see if different types of bullying have stronger or weaker relationships. It would also be interesting to look at protective factors like peers and supportive school environments to see how that alters the relationship. Well, thank you for listening. I've put my contact details there in case anybody wants to chat about this later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from online audience or in-person audience? We've got 3 other people as well as myself here in the room here.
Could I ask a question which is not necessarily concerned with bullying, but it's with the term? So you used intellectual disability, and generally I know there's a trend towards that term as opposed to learning disability. See, you've got Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory. Is there any difference between learning disability and intellectual disability as such?
So generally, if you're looking at the literature, if you're looking at research, the international research community would use intellectual disability because different countries use different terms, and this way it keeps it's standardized. We all know that it means someone who has an IQ of 70 or below, and they need support with 2 or more everyday adaptive skills. I feel like learning disability is more common just within the public. I mean, I even work for an organisation that's called the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory. So charities and the government tend to use learning disability as it's just more, it's better understood within the public what we mean by a learning disability. But for this purpose, I was using them interchangeably.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just a question about labelling, and labels in the hands of children can be quite vicious, especially when it comes to things to do with intelligence and such like what's also being intelligent. Whereas learning disability sounds more about the process rather than a labelling of intellect. But anyway, I'm just distracting from your bullying topic.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone online, Ben? Online chat
at the moment, but I had one if nobody else does.
Yeah.
And then perhaps we move on so that everybody has about 15 minutes. So, okay, so my question, oh, sorry, hold on. No, perhaps there's one in Kirsty, you can just clarify that in the chat afterward. So my question was related to the differences in the findings between the parent and the child reporting. If I understood that table correctly, where you highlighted the yellow column. So did you? I mean, what were the reasons? I mean, it seemed to me that the parents obviously were reporting bullying far more. Is that right? Or they were explaining the differences? Could you just clarify? And then how would you explain that? Was it because the scale was not adapted to the adolescents, or?
So yeah, it's interesting that we found differences there. I mean, we are working with quite small numbers. And what we did find was when we reran the analysis, accounting for missing data, which gave us a much larger sample because we'd restricted it to only individuals that had all the information on every covariate, the mediator, the outcome. But when we relaxed that and accounted for missing data, we did find a statistically significant mediation for the children reported bullying as well.
Okay.
So it might just have been the sample size was the issue.
Okay.
But of course, it was a different question that was asked of the children and the parents, okay. Which makes it trickier to compare. If I just pull up my screen very briefly.
Please do.
If we go to the 2 questions, so you can see that the parents were asked to what extent they believe it's true their child was bullied, whereas the children are asked how frequently they're bullied, so they're not even really comparable as questions,
right.
Which is a bit tricky for interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, that's great.
Okay.
I think
Professor Rod Taylor, do you want to come and load up your screen?
Thank you very much, Kirsty.
Is that yours?
Do I need to share that? So
Yeah,
does
I can do that.
go?
Share screen. Okay, I don't know if it's best to sit there or
Shall I sit here?
that or the keyboard. What would you prefer?
Nice if I can. Well, thank you, Hamish and Ben remotely, and the cross-theme organising committee for the opportunity of giving this presentation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rod Taylor. I'm based here in the school and I'm split between SPHSU and the Robertson Centre for Biostatistics. So what I was going to try and cover in this presentation today was really 3 things. So unlike the previous presenter, I'm not going to present on a specific project, but really an area of research interest, a methodological area of research interest. So to do that, I'm going to talk about initially a couple of things. So one is the problem, surrogate endpoints, and some of the issues about using these in clinical trials. As will become apparent, a lot of this activity has not been in the area of public health. So given that's where we are, I thought we could maybe reflect on, is this an issue that matters to us working in public health and complex interventions? And then lastly, just close by talking about an ongoing project that we're leading here in Glasgow, which is an extension to the Consort and Spirit reporting guidelines for trials that use surrogate outcomes. And this is funded by the MRC Better Methods for Better Research project. So that's the menu. Let's make a start. So for those of you who are not familiar with the paradigm or the concept, what is a surrogate outcome? So these are endpoints that we use in clinical trials and have really got 2 key pillars in terms of their rationale. So the first is that we are substituting for an outcome that we may feel of particular relevance. We often call this the participant or the patient relevant final outcome, or the PRFO. And then the second element of this is that the surrogate, we're using it because we believe it is predictive of that outcome. So substitution and prediction, and I'll come back to the notion of prediction and what evidence we might have, but that could be pathophysiological, it could be epidemiological, or it could be intervention-based. So this is just a simple graphic to show you an example of how we might use surrogate endpoints in clinical trials. And just to make the point that traditionally we've tended to think about surrogate outcomes being biomarkers. So these, as defined in this slide here from the FDA NIHR biomarker group, is a characteristic blood-borne histological radiographic that can respond to the therapeutic intervention. So a couple of examples then. So one example, and forgive me, the forward on the screen and the computer aren't quite the same. Okay, so a couple of examples. So the first is systolic blood pressure, or LDL cholesterol. So I do trials in cardiovascular disease. So we might collect those biomarkers as surrogates, where the final patient outcome of interest might be cardiovascular events, be it cardiovascular death or cardiovascular hospitalization. In contrast, if we're working on oncology, we may be looking at a particular tumour, whatever that area of cancer might be. So we would look at the tumour response as the surrogate outcome, where the final outcome of interest may be the overall survival of the patient with cancer, and we're seeing how the intervention responds. So, obvious question, why then do we use surrogate outcomes as opposed to the final outcome? And I'm sure it's pretty obvious to you that one of the benefits of using surrogate outcomes is the whole area of trial efficiency. So we can do trials quicker, we don't need so much follow-up in terms of duration, we can actually reduce sample size, and clearly, whether we are a researcher or you're a drug company, that can be attractive because we can reduce the overall R&D cost. Another key area of rationale is that the area of regulation, particularly drug licensing, has a long history of the use of surrogate outcomes. So particularly accelerated pathways, and by accelerated pathways, be it the FDA in the US, or EMEA, the European Medicines Agency, or the MHRA in UK, these tend to be situations where we want to look at licensing a biologic or a drug where we may not have an existing treatment. It may be an orphan condition, and we want to make decisions quickly. I'll come back to that notion, though, of whether this is just restricted to accelerated pathways. And then last but not least, perhaps less obviously, there can be methodological reasons for using surrogates. So for instance, if you're in oncology, although the final outcome might be overall survival, that can be a bit of a problem if you're looking at a first-line cancer agent, because, for instance, if you relapse, we will often then introduce a rescue therapy. And if there's asymmetry in the use of rescue therapies between the intervention and control, we're going to introduce bias in terms of assessing the impact on the overall survival. But if we use relapse as the outcome, in other words, tumour reduction, we don't have that bias. So the surrogate has a methodological benefit in this setting. So a variety of reasons for using surrogate outcomes. So let's just go back to the FDA. So this was a publication, it's a little bit older now, but it still broadly holds, published looking at the FDA. So the particular thing I want to focus on is this statistic. So they looked at about 450 trials that were underpinning approvals that the FDA had to make. And the first thing to say is about 50% of those were as the result of a surrogate outcome. So surrogate outcome is very common in the approval setting. And then if we say, well, what sorts of conditions were being considered here, you can see a range, but we tend to think about the use of surrogate outcomes, particularly in cancer, infectious diseases, and also in cardiovascular disease. But perhaps the most interesting finding from this study is that they looked at the question of whether these uses were limited to an accelerated approval or not. And the point to make is that whilst the majority of accelerated approvals were based on a surrogate, almost half of the non-accelerated approvals were also based on surrogates. So just to make the point, we tend to base a lot of our approval decisions on surrogate evidence as opposed to final outcome. So, okay, all very interesting, Rod, but does this have any relevance for us at all in public health? Well, I'm going to put it to you, yes, it does. And we may not talk about biomarkers in public health, but we certainly talk about the paradigm of surrogates, often by the use of what we might call intermediate outcomes. So again, here's our flow diagram I showed you earlier. Intermediate outcomes are often closer to the final outcome, but the principle holds true. So let me give you a couple of examples. So in my area, cardiovascular disease, I like to look at exercise-based rehabilitation trials. And whilst my final outcome might be health-related quality of life, we often use exercise capacity as a surrogate outcome. So we are substituting for quality of life, and we believe it is predictive. Similarly, maybe a more example closer to home, public health, we might want to do a randomised controlled trial. This is an intervention, for instance, that's around improving healthy eating. Our surrogate might be to look at people's healthy eating habits, but we're not actually observing the outcome of ultimate interest, which might be, does that intervention ultimately improve people's risk of cardiovascular disease? So as I hopefully have shown you here, surrogate outcomes are certainly things that apply to us. I would put it as much in the public health space as in others. It's just that we don't talk about it as much. So all good, but any particular issues then with the use of surrogate outcomes? Well, there are two things we need to bear in mind. This publication is probably a citation classic in the end, Fleming and Demetz, published back in '96 in Annals of Internal Medicine. And basically this paper, I commend you if you're interested in this area, is a litany of surrogate outcomes that had been approved by the FDA that then turned out to be used in practice, but actually ended up predicting harm rather than actually benefit. So in other words, surrogates that were believed to be beneficial in trials actually turned out, when we looked at the use of the intervention, to be more harmful than beneficial. And they cite a number of case examples, and indeed there have been a number of these case studies published since. Another issue is this more subtle one, and this was studied by a PhD of mine when I was in Exeter now about 10 years ago, where we did a comparison, a meta-epidemiological study, comparing randomised controlled trials that had a primary outcome that was a surrogate, and then matched those with randomised controlled trials with the primary outcome as the final outcome. And basically, the key conclusion from this slide is that we overestimate treatment effects when we use surrogates compared to final outcomes by about 47%. And of course, that's not a small amount of overestimation. And of course, if we are then going on and looking at the cost effectiveness of these treatments, we may be implementing treatments that are perhaps not as cost effective as we might believe. So clearly surrogates aren't going to go away, but as I've shown you, they do come with a bit of a health warning. So what can we do about this in terms of our practice? Well, one area that's very important in terms of if you're thinking about using surrogate outcomes in clinical trials is the importance of validation. Now, I don't have time to go through the statistics behind this. This review paper, myself and Chris Weir in Edinburgh, talks about some of the methods, but essentially we need to have an evidence base that the surrogate is truly predictive of the final outcome. So I'll give you two examples. So here's an example. First of all, looking at a cross-sectional or a correlational based association, where the surrogate outcome is progression-free survival. Again, this is cancer. But the final outcome of interest is overall survival. And each of these dots is could be a patient. So you can see here that there does appear to be a correlation between the surrogate outcome in the x-axis and the final outcome in the y-axis. But really the level of evidence we want is not a correlation-based association, but an association between the treatment effect, which is, again, we've got the same outcome, but now on the x-axis is the delta progression-free survival, which is versus the delta overall survival as in a clinical trial setting. And you can again see, actually, for this example I've given you, there does appear to be a strong linear correlation, not albeit perfect, between these two outcomes. So in other words, we should be restricting ourselves to only using surrogates in approval settings where we have evidence of their formal validation. However, another issue, and maybe getting towards our project ongoing in Glasgow, is the whole issue of reporting of randomised controlled trials. So this was a study published in the BMJ back now almost a decade ago, over a decade ago, where they looked at 626 RCTs published over a 12-month period in major high-impact journals, so BMJ, Lancet, New England, etc. And first of all, they noted about 1 in 5 trials using surrogate primary endpoints. So back to that FD analysis, surrogates are not uncommon. But rather worryingly, the next 2 points, first of all, the number of studies actually reporting clearly that the primary was a surrogate, so actually owning up that the primary was a surrogate, that only happened in 57% of trials. And then going back, and I've highlighted the evidence of validity and the importance of only 1/3 of the trials actually mentioning or presenting the validity behind the surrogate measure that's being used. So in view of this, okay, so I've got 2 more slides and then I'm done. So because of this, we've now instituted this project where we're looking at developing an extension guidance for consort and spirit reporting trials using surrogates. And I'd just like to acknowledge Anthony Manyara, who's in our unit and leading this project. And we're using what's called the equator approach here. Because of time, I won't summarize, but you can see it's a multi-phased approach. If you want to know more about the project, the links are there. These are just some of the publications we've recently made to try and raise the awareness of this problem in the literature. Where are we at? We are just about to enter into our 2nd round of the Delphi. We hope to publish the checklist back in June and July, if you'll have us back. Hamish and Ben will be pleased to present. And then last but not least, if you are interested in contributing, our Delphi is closed, but we are going to be looking for individuals to pilot our finalised checklist. And obviously, if you'd like to be on our mail list to be receive the published checklist, you can do so, and that's an expression of interest form. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you very much.
Shall I pop out the way and we'll let our next speaker in?
Okay, and maybe for the interest of time, thank you. Not working. Not you, isn't it? Yes.
Okay, so thanks everyone. So this presentation is slightly different from the other 2. So this is about a campaign, a national campaign, which began in May this year. It's called This Is Me, Valuing the Lives of People with Learning Disabilities. So if you've not heard of the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory before, we were set up in 2015 by the Scottish Government. And this was as a result of the Keys to Life strategy coming out in 2013, which made this recommendation for the observatory to robustly underpin health improvement and to address health inequalities in people with learning disabilities. Oh, sorry. So if you're not familiar with what a learning disability is, this is a definition by the World Health Organization, which defines learning disabilities as impairments in adaptive functioning, social functioning, and intellectual functioning. And around 1 to 3% of the global population have a diagnosis of a learning disability. So what do we do at the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory? Well, we look at health trends for people with learning disabilities and people with autism across Scotland. We find out where there are information gaps and what we need to address. And we mainly do that by looking at secondary data analysis and data linkage, but we do look at other methods, but that's the primary method that we use. And we very much take a leadership role in relation to the translation of evidence into policy and practice. So a lot of the work that we have published has been cited in the government recommendations and strategies. So that's something that we're very proud of. So at the Observatory, we work across a number of projects. I think there's around 50 projects that we've worked on over the last sort of 7 to 8 years since the inception of the Observatory. And this is just to give you an example of the different types of work that we do. So we look at the physical health of people with learning disabilities. We look at specific health conditions such as oral health. We were very much involved in looking at the impact of COVID-19 on adults with learning disabilities. We look at mental health, we look at drug prescribing and hate crime, and we look at bullying, which you heard about from Kirsty earlier on in the session. And one project I want to just refer you to into how we came about this campaign was the Research Voices project, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust back in 2018. And this was a joint project between the Observatory and Talking Mats, which is a social enterprise to support individuals who require support with communication and to have their voices heard. So this project brought together people with learning disabilities to do a number of things. So one, to provide insights into the views of people with learning disabilities on health research. It was also to challenge attitudinal barriers to involvement of people with learning disabilities as research participants, as subjects and collaborators. It was also to challenge structural barriers that limit opportunities for inclusion in research, and also to generate recommendations supporting inclusive public engagement in health research. And so from one of the recommendations from the group of individuals with learning disabilities was that there should be a campaign around the health of people with learning disabilities. And that this campaign should raise awareness of the poor health of people with learning disabilities. It should talk about how to make things more simple for people with learning disabilities. And it should also change people's ideas about people with learning disabilities. And so we listened to this recommendation, and from that, we conceived the idea of this campaign, which was funded through the Glasgow Knowledge Exchange funding. So just moving on to what the campaign was about. So it's a bit slow. There we go. So this is me valuing the lives of people with learning disabilities as a campaign about challenging the stigma, the discrimination and inequalities experienced by people with learning disabilities. So we collaborated with people with learning disabilities, with family carers and a number of third sector organisations to increase public awareness about the experiences of people with learning disabilities. And we did this through a series of short films and a targeted social media campaign. And as I said, our campaign and the aim was to challenge stigma, discrimination and hopefully to influence positive change. So why is this campaign important? Well, it's important because people with learning disabilities are, first and foremost, they're citizens with rights, needs, hopes, dreams and goals. But we know that people with learning disabilities are not always valued as equal citizens in society, and they continue to experience this discrimination and stigma across all the areas of their life, and that's evidenced through huge health and social inequalities. Now, just to give you an example, based on all of the research that's been done at the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory, from our research, we know that people with learning disabilities die up to 20 years earlier than the general population. There is also much poorer access to healthcare, so people with learning disabilities, from one piece of our work, we found that people with learning disabilities are at least 10 times more likely than other people of the same age to have none of their natural teeth. So that leads to concerns that they're missing out on basic dental healthcare. We also know from another study that the average number of physical health conditions recorded for people with learning disabilities during a health assessment was as high as 11, and 99% of the cohort who took part in those health assessments had multiple morbidities. So that's having 2 or more conditions in addition to having a diagnosis of a learning disability. From Scotland's census, the most recent data that we have available, which is unfortunately back in 2011, we'll soon have the 2022 census data. But from this data, we know that in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, only 9.5% of adults with learning disabilities are in paid employment, compared with 52.3% of all adults. And we also know from the research that there are higher rates of hate crime and bullying, which are invisible. So people with learning disabilities are much more likely than the general population to experience violence and hate crime at all stages of their life. So what did we do? So as I mentioned, we shared 8 stories of people with learning disabilities and their family carers, alongside this research evidence about the health and wellbeing of people with learning disabilities, with the hope to raise awareness to the general public about the lives of people with learning disabilities and to challenge the negative attitudes which are very common in society. And our goal was obviously to encourage public understanding that everyone, including people with learning disabilities, has the right to equal healthcare, employment opportunities, and to feel safe in their community. We also decided to carry out a survey, and we invited 1,000 people across Scotland to complete this online because we wanted to gather a snapshot of public understanding and attitudes about learning disabilities. And we did this because over the last almost 8 years of working at the Observatory, we've realised when we've gone to public engagement events that there's this huge lack of understanding and knowledge about what a learning disability is and the impact that this can often have on people's lives. And this was a view that was very much shared amongst our project partners, who Scottish Commission for Learning Disabilities and PAMIS and Down Syndrome Scotland. So what did we find from the survey? So we had 1,002 respondents who completed the survey, and the findings were actually quite surprising because 77% of people said that they knew what learning disability was based on the options that we gave. And the public also said that people with learning disabilities should have the same opportunities as people without learning disabilities in paid employment, so 90% said that, and also in education, 91%. The public also said that health and social care services should be adapted for this population, so things like having longer appointments at the GP. So as I said, these were not as expected. The plan with this survey was to carry out a survey prior to the campaign to gauge people's understanding, and then to have another survey after to see if there was an improvement in understanding. But as you can see, we decided not to do that because people clearly knew what a learning disability was. But interestingly, what we also found from the survey was that participants said that they could do more personally to help eliminate bullying, so 57% said that. 65% said that they could help do more to eliminate the use of negative words and phrases towards people with learning disabilities. And 51% said they could do more personally to eliminate hate crime. And as we've heard from Kirsty earlier on in the presentation and from the other research evidence I presented, we know that discrimination, hate crime, bullying and violence towards people with learning disabilities is occurring at a significant level. So this campaign has really highlighted that there is so much more that needs to be done to increase awareness of these inequalities. So how successful has our campaign been so far? So it started in May this year and it's still ongoing. We have amplification days. But it's been really successful in that the campaign received the highest reach or interactions for any activity that's been carried out by the Observatory since its establishment in 2015. We do a lot of work on Twitter, we have a lot of tweets, and over the last 5 months, when we put out tweets from the Observatory in general, we reach on average around 68,000 impressions. But with our campaign alone, we, in the same period of time, reached 3.2 million impressions using the hashtag #ThisIsMe22. The hashtag itself is used over 1,200 times. We put our films on Facebook and they reached over 13,500 people. We also put it on YouTube and it was viewed over 1,400 times. We set up a small web page and it was visited over 1,200 times. We also got a lot of attention in the media, so STV News covered the campaign and covered it on their social media as well. And we also worked in collaboration with the BBC, who had an exclusive on a piece of our work. Oh, it's not coming up, sorry. There we go. They reported an exclusive piece of work about mortality among people with learning disabilities, and we used this as an opportunity to further amplify the importance of the inequalities experienced by people with learning disabilities and why our campaign was so important. So what does this all mean? Well, this has been the furthest audience that we've reached ever before and connected with, so that's fantastic news for us. And that means that more audiences are engaging with this conversation around stigma, around discrimination and health inequalities experienced by people with learning disabilities. And I don't know if I've got time, this is a 1-minute video and I don't know if it will work. Just to kind of highlight, so I would really advocate and encourage you to go onto our website to look at the short films that are made by our self-advocates around disabilities and carers. And this is a few words from our project partners, just highlighting why this campaign is so important. Can you see that? No, it's not going to work. No. Okay. Before.
Or should we share the link with people?
Yeah, we can.
Afterwards, so they...
Yeah. Or there it is. Can you see the video?
I think we need to share a different screen, but I don't know if we'll have a difficulty with sound. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
Share the screen and then. Yeah, I don't think they're going to be able to hear that unless we fiddle with this.
No, don't worry.
Sorry about that.
No,
Want me to
no.
bring up the presentation
Yeah,
again?
wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, just last slide. Okay, so you can watch these videos on our website. It just really highlighting the importance of the campaign and the commitment and support we've had from external third sector organisations. So what next? Oh, trigger happy.
There's a delay in the computer.
Just leave it at that.
Yeah, they can see.
Okay, so what next? So we've got a public engagement event coming up next month, and that's to bring together people with learning disabilities and carers to tell us more about why they think this campaign is important and to really help us with the next steps and how we can improve things. We also plan to have a roundtable discussion to discuss the feedback from this workshop and also to discuss the campaign more widely, so that we can share that with policymakers, practitioners, people with learning disabilities, family carers and other organisations. And ultimately our goal is to influence policy and practice and to improve the lives of people with learning disabilities. Thank you for listening. Sorry about all the technical issues.
Thank you very much. I know it's 1 o'clock, but does anyone have any questions for Professor Kinnear? Anyone online?
Stand Joe into silence.
Sounds like a fantastic campaign. I'm certainly going to follow you on Twitter, and that sounds like a lot of hits on your websites and stuff.
Yes.
Given the competition out there. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you so much for our speakers, and sincere apologies about the late start and apologies to the audience for our technical difficulties here. But I think those were 3 fantastic presentations, so thank you very much. There are other opportunities to present at this sort of seminar series, so please feel free to contact any one of us, so myself, Hamish Foster, or Ben Rigby. Please feel free to contact us and we'll get you to present your work. It's an opportunity. Hopefully there'll be more time next time to interact and have a discussion about people's work across the different research themes. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thanks, Hamish.
Thank you, Ben. Goodbye.